I'm happy today. In fact, I'm very happy, and I'm extremely proud to be able to present the donation for the André Mischke 2020 prize winner, Dr. Grant Hill-Cawthorne, who's the head of the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology in the UK Parliament. How did we get here today? About 10 years ago, when I met André Mischke and 10 other scientists with different backgrounds, from different countries, and we met in Paris in a small old building, in a small old room in the building. There's still some raised hands. I think this is just leftovers. In Paris, and at least I think one other of us, Alban Kellebauer, is here today, founding member. It was back then when André's vision that drove us 11 people to create a European platform for young scientists in order to have a voice in science policy. And it was André's drive, enthusiasm that inspired us. It was the seed of what has become today the Young Academy of Europe. Today there are more than 250 fellows, current and past members, and each fellow has a voice that helps shape Europe's science arena, and present and past board members, chairs, vice chairs have gone all the extra mile to make it all work. The André Mischke Prize was established and renamed in honor of André, founding chair of the Young Academy, because Europe and the world needs more Andrés who go out of their way to make science and society a better place to be, and not just today, but also in and for the future. This year, the prize is awarded to Grant Hill-Cawthorne in recognition of his outstanding achievements and contributions to science, evidence-based policy making, science communication, and the support of future generation scientists and scholars in Europe. Grant is an example par excellence who has made significant contributions to all of these missions of the Young Academy of Europe, and he's a true gem. I first met Grant on a science policy panel in London, and he struck me to be an exceptional human being. He helped me calm down just before the panel started. And he's a scientist at heart with an eclectic research career who has conducted his research in research laboratories on different continents across the world. The topics he worked on included so many different ones, some of which I cannot even pronounce. It included autism, genetics, neuroimmunology of multiple sclerosis, virology, tuberculosis, genomics, and antimicrobial resistance, etc., etc. And what makes him stand out is his decision to move from science into science policy professionally when he took up his role as head of the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology in April 2018. It is that move that not many scientists consider yet, and I trust you would agree with me that science and policy must go hand in hand if society is to tackle future challenges that in fact are with us already. It's not just the future, it's climate change, plastic pollution, COVID, just to name a few, and we're all sick, tired of hearing them, but we need to handle them. This year, Grant has also been the president of the European Parliamentary Technology Assessment Network, which is the international organization for legislative science advice units, quite important institutions. And he's been using this role and the concept of post as a new model for bringing the worlds of academia and policymaking closer together. With his refreshing personality, and you will see in a minute, he's been inspiring young and established scholars alike, and therefore I cannot think of a better awardee for the André Mischke Prize 2020 than Grant. He's everything in one person that makes the YAE special. With him also being based in the UK, and with Brexit looming, the YAE message could not have been stronger by selecting Grant as the prize winner 2020. Science does not happen behind borders. Policy needs science and also people who believe in a better world. I'm very happy that Grant Hill-Cawthorne is this year's prize winner, and I'm sure André would have been absolutely thrilled. Thank you. Grant, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nicole. No, thank you. It's a great honor, and thank you all for having me here virtually. I feel like I spend probably about 13, 14 hours a day in this room in front of this computer, as many of you do. So I'll try to make this as lively as possible, and we'll hopefully see you all next year in person. So what I'll do is I will share my presentation with you. Just let me know if you can't see that. You should see a very nice stylized picture of the Houses of Parliament. Can you all see that?
Yep.
It works.
So what I was going to do is talk about science advice in the UK and then where Post fits into this and a lot of the changes that have happened because of COVID. And as Nicole pointed to, I can't think of many examples where science advice has had a greater prominence in at least the last decade. So I'll talk about very quickly is government versus parliament, because the Westminster system, while it's been exported around the world, still causes lots of confusion in this country. So I always start with that slide. And then just to talk about how we do science advice, first in government in the UK, but then also in Parliament, and then what we've done to tackle COVID within Parliament itself. So UK Parliament is made up of three parts. So we have the monarch, who is the monarch in Parliament, and a monarch's main role is to open and dissolve Parliament, and also to give royal assent to change bills into acts. We have a democratically elected chamber of 650 members, each of which represents about 150,000 constituents in the UK. And we have a nominated House of Lords, which is mostly made up of experts from various different fields in life. So we do have lots of scientists, for example, in the House of Lords, as well as lots of teachers and social workers and people from many other professions. The government and parliament are quite distinct, but also are very much combined in the UK system. So the party that commands the majority of parliament is invited by the Queen to create Her Majesty's government. And so typically this would be the party that has the largest number of seats. And we rarely have coalitions in the UK. We tend to have majority governments. And the leader of that party will be invited by the Queen to form a government. They will then appoint their own cabinet. So they'll choose a large number of ministers, and some of those would be secretaries of state to lead each department. But the key thing is they remain part of Parliament and accountable to Parliament within that. Parliament, as I said, holds the government to account and has a key role in scrutiny. And so we have parliamentary select committees, for example, that scrutinise every single government department. And we have some general committees that scrutinise things like spending or how the civil service works, how science works, for example, and how science policy works. Parliament is also there to make laws, and also is the only way that the government can raise money each year and spend money. So how does science advice work for the government, first of all? So there's lots and lots of different models of science advice around the world. Some countries depend upon advisory councils to their executive. Some have lots of committees. Some, the national academies, play a very significant role. And some have a scientific advisor model. And so the first CSA was in the US, I think, in 1957, and then the UK closely followed. And so just under the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Cabinet Secretariat sits the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. So they have a very prominent role within government in the UK, and they directly advise the Prime Minister and Cabinet, sit on the National Security Council, and can attend COBRA, which is our emergency cabinet, which I'll describe in a minute. They're supported now by a network of chief scientific advisors, and the idea is that every single government department has one. So everyone from the Treasury to the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office has a chief scientific advisor. And they're supported by a Government Office for Science, which is like Post, but with lots more funding and with lots more people. but also a big infrastructure of evidence in the UK. So things such as what work centres, like NICE, which is the best example. You then have all the experts that feed into that. But what people often forget is that the civil service has quite a large science and engineering profession as well. That sits alongside its social research profession, its statisticians, its economists. So science and research really does fit throughout that. And so there's a lot that happens. And studies have shown that this direct chief science advisor model is often very effective because they can both give very private advice to the Prime Minister or the President, but can also be trusted and can act as an independent voice within government. And particularly in the UK role, the GCSA technically can say whatever they want. They are slightly less bound to civil service rules than many others. In an emergency in the UK, as we are continuously at the moment, we have an emergency group called COBRA, and that is more or less the way that the machinery of government works across different departments. Because when you bring COBRA together, the idea is that there's some kind of emergency where you need every department working together. And this is a way of bringing all the secretaries of state into the room. But this is very much underpinned by science and technical advice. And so anyone that follows UK response to COVID at the moment will definitely have heard of SAGE. And SAGE is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, is typically chaired by the government chief scientific advisor. And in cases like COVID, where it's a public health crisis, is co-chaired by the chief medical officer. But SAGE isn't a static thing. It is a group of experts brought together that are specific to each emergency. So the current SAGE is very different to the SAGE for the Novichok problems, for example. That's then supported by a large number of different groups, some of which are modelling groups, some look at behavioural science, some look at the underpinning virology and transmission of the virus. And each of these groups is supported by about 60 others. So it's a huge effort at the moment of science advice. Now, the government is very well resourced in science advice, and Parliament less so. And I'll talk about how we've changed that. And certainly, if we look at the post notes that came out back in the early 90s and 1989 when Post was set up, there were certain things that were coming up time and time again that were difficult for parliamentarians to deal with. One example was the Human Embryology and Fertilisation Bill was starting to go through Parliament. So the understanding the ethics and the science of IVF. Computers were not only being used much more, but starting to be hacked. I love this image of a virus being introduced on a 5¼ floppy disk. And it shows that people were bringing in the Computer Misuse Bill to try to tackle what was perceived to be a future threat. We had this unknown disease that was appearing in cows called bovine spongiform encephalopathy that ended up spilling over into humans in a form of variant CJD and wasn't really understood at that stage. The Human Genome Project had just started in the UK and US, and then global warming was starting to become recognised. So all 5 of these are taken from early Post notes and just show why Post was set up. It was to tackle these kind of problems. And so a group of MPs and Lords went over to the United States because they were looking for a model on how you actually provide legislative science advice. And the model they used was the Office of Technology Assessment, which was a huge enterprise and had a budget of $22 million a year, had 120 different scientists working for it. But it was there to do technology assessment. It was there to identify those changes in science, those changes in technology that will affect the public and need to be explained to parliamentarians to understand the societal consequences, the economic, the ethical, the legal consequences of those changes. And so that group of parliamentarians went back to the UK and established a charity, which was Post. So Post started in 1989 as a charity. It produced what were called information for member briefings. And then over time, it proved itself. It was funded by Parliament, and then it was made permanent in 2001 and started producing Post notes, which have now more or less been taken up in a large number of countries. The US Congress now starts producing them. I've seen examples from Colombia, examples from Mexico. Lots of countries use this format, which I'll describe in a minute. In addition, Post has continued to evolve. So in 2013, Post added a social science section to make sure that horizon scanning covered social sciences. And then in 2018, we created the Knowledge Exchange Unit. So I came in 2018 on the back of a report that had just come out about UK Parliament, which was ostensibly a large research project looking at what role research plays in the way Parliament works. And interestingly, what this found was parliamentarians and parliamentary staff didn't actually know what was meant by the term research. As a group of scientists, we know that research is using the scientific method. It's an iterative process of induction and deduction. But a lot of people in Parliament thought research was going on Google, finding any old document that you can think of, using that as a basis for information. And what was even more telling were the findings that academics and researchers were not getting in front of our committees. Our select committees often viewed academics as being a group of interested stakeholders that sit alongside any other group of interested stakeholders. So very much they had an opinion and this was their opinion. But the fact that it was underpinned by scientific evidence wasn't necessarily taken through. So I was hired with the role of how do we actually embed research? How do we make these links better? And how do we actually teach academics how to work with Parliament to get their research listened to and impact in scrutiny and policy? So on our 30th anniversary in 2019, I launched a new strategy called Post at 30. And this was very much recognising that the role of a science advice unit is as a policy broker. It's to act between researchers and legislatures to translate and understand and connect policy and research. And so our tagline continues to be bridging research and policy. And this is very much about bringing what we call research evidence. So evidence that is underpinned by scientific research to bear on scrutiny and the legislative process. And we do that in a number of ways. We formally partner with the whole academy in the UK, and we do this through a knowledge exchange unit. So I have some dedicated staff that actually go out normally in person to universities, but now electronically, to train academics in how to engage with Parliament, to kind of spread the word of how research can have an impact on the work of parliamentarians and to inform different things. So in the UK, we have the Research Excellence Framework, which is a way that the government looks at and funds research. And so we have worked with Research England to put parliamentary scrutiny very much within that. We organise horizon scanning. So Post was originally set up as a proactive technology assessment unit. That's very close to our hearts. We find that's one of the few sections within Parliament that does that forward horizon scanning process. And so we continue to produce Post notes each year. However, what I wanted Post to do was also be much more reactive to the needs of select committees. So we also produce evidence briefs where we synthesize current research evidence into summaries, and that's done directly for select committees to make sure that when an inquiry has been undertaken, that inquiry is underpinned by evidence from the outset, and we can then call witnesses to interrogate that evidence. And then we also train. We train both policymakers, so parliamentarians and parliamentary staff in research methods, but also try to train the next generations of what I call policy-wise researchers. 35 PhD students that come and join us each year to learn how to write for policy. So our flagship product, as I said, is a Post note, and this is a culmination of 30 to 35 stakeholder interviews from across academia, the civil service, civil society groups, etc., all boiled down into 4 pages. And they are targeted at areas that are emerging, where there's not a huge amount of published evidence out there, and where parliamentarians have a need for a very concise summary of the very latest thoughts on these areas. We also produce longer post briefs that are done reactively for select committees to explore in-depth key topics. So UK natural hazards, for example, and how we look at the national risk assessment. And we do this in a diverse area. So these are some of the recent post notes we've published, as well as some of the ones we're working on at the moment. And you can see we cover everything from zoonotic diseases to the future use of hydrogen to digital skills for life and liver and organ donation. And this is all done by a team of 12 people, I should say. So they're very hardworking and they're a fantastic team, and they are actually the reason I'm here. So they are definitely the ones that should be awarded this prize. Our horizon scanning process, I'm going to include the slide, but effectively we have a formal process that every 18 months we gather together the latest articles in science. We put this in front of a group of academics that help us appraise them and combine them into topics of change. And then we write one-page summaries of each of those topics of change that will then eventually evolve into our post-note list that we then produce post-notes from. So it's a continuous basis of horizon scanning, looking forward to about the next 5 years. So I try to think of it as a kind of parliamentary cycle. Now, COVID has made us innovate in ways we never thought we would, and these are just some of them. So one is, very luckily, we just launched a new website that allowed us to publish straight into HTML. And so we've been producing rapid response articles in 1 or 2 weeks. And these have covered the evidence base for everything that I can think of. And I'm a virologist, so it's all the things I can think of for COVID. So the effectiveness of face masks, the immune system's response to COVID, how we should prioritize vaccinations once we have one, the impact that our school closures and lockdown have had on the disadvantage gap between pupils in primary and secondary schools, the long-term health effects of COVID, vaccines, the effect on the food supply chain, looking at COVID both in children and the transmission in schools, and also child and adolescent mental health during lockdown. We've looked at the science of social distancing and whether 2 meters or 1 meters is the correct number, looking at the new therapies, how we can cope with winter pressures, test accuracy, contact tracing apps. So you name it, I think we've covered it. And if I'm missing anything, please do let me know, because we're constantly churning these out at the moment. The other thing we've done is use these to feed directly into inquiry work. So some of the select committee inquiries we've fed into have been recent one on COVID and food supply chain by one of the Commons committees, the Digital Culture, Media and Sport subcommittee on online harms and disinformation have been looking at the effects of COVID disinformation. There's a big inquiry in the House of Lords looking at the science behind COVID that all of our briefings have fed into. The effect of COVID on humanitarian crises, how we can better prepare for COVID in the future, whether we should have brought in quarantine on our borders earlier. We've done research on that. So there's been a huge amount of different inquiries. And I think we're up to about 45 simultaneous inquiries at the moment. So Parliament is a really busy place. We've also realised that there's lots of academics out there that wanted to help us. So very early on, we put up a web page to say exactly how researchers can contact us and help us with all of these COVID deliberations. And we also produced a short briefing of the ways in which you can support Parliament in our work at the moment. So everything from submitting evidence to making sure your research is in line with the kind of needs that we need, to partnering with us on research projects. We also launched an expert database. So we actually simply asked everyone to self-identify if they have expertise in a huge number of different areas for COVID. And within 2 weeks, 5,500 people had signed up in all areas of science, arts, humanities. And that has allowed us to produce 16 different reports where we sent out a survey and asked them, what are you concerned about? What are your short, medium and long-term concerns about COVID? What should we be thinking about within Parliament? And 1,100 experts helped us by giving us their thoughts. And then we used social science methods, so thematic analyses, to bring those down into 16 different publications. That has then fed into a long-term inquiry called Life Beyond COVID that the Lord's COVID-19 committee is doing. And so again, we went to our experts and we said, once COVID's over, what are the societal changes that it will bring in for the positive or the negative? And we recently published this at the end of last month, covering everything from the future of employment to how it might affect the social care system to the built environment. We've also used this to try out something completely new, which is areas of research interest within Parliament. So a few years ago, a government review suggested that each government department should be putting out the areas that it would like scientific research in and the kind of questions that it's struggling with at the moment. And so we used our 1,000 experts and we prioritised with UK Parliament staff to come up with a big list of areas of research interest that our committees are interested in. And under each of these 20 topics are about 5 to 10 questions that we are interested in Parliament. And we've also set up a repository where, as research comes in that meets any of these needs, that can then be deposited, and we're searching through that to supply committees. So a lot of activity. As I say, these are a hugely functional and working 12 people that have managed to do all of this. So our next steps in the last couple of minutes. One is thinking about the way select committees work. So the liaison committee, which is the overall committee of chairs of committees within the House of Commons, did an inquiry last year looking at the effectiveness of the select committee system. And we fed into that quite heavily. And some of the recommendations looked at all the different ways that academia can actually feed into that process. And we've had some early wins here. So we've got the areas of research interest for COVID ticked off. We've been working a lot on digital engagement. We've managed to increase some of our witness diversity, both across different types of universities, between different ages of academics, but also between protected characteristics coming in front of our select committees. But there's a lot more we can do, particularly as we prepare for the next emergency. And we know everything that we've learned from COVID and the state of emergency it's created can now be used for climate change. And so one thing we have set up is ahead of the UK presidency of the G8 and hosting of COP26 next November, we've again put together an expert database of a few hundred academics who can feed into how COP26 should be run. The 6 select committees also got together, aided by Post, producing the Underpinning Science, to convene a climate assembly. So a group of 200 citizens that came together to help us work out what are the next steps to actually achieve a net zero, which, as you know, is a government target for the UK by 2050. So both of these are key things to be working on next. So this has been a very quick run through of some of the stuff we've been doing. We've got lots and lots of resources on our website, which is very new and shiny and launched a couple of weeks ago. We also have some dedicated pages, particularly aimed at academics, on how you can engage with Parliament, the way we use research, and how-to guides, so how to write written evidence, how to present to a select committee. And we also host parliamentary academic fellowships. So each year we have big calls to try and get academics who want to come and be embedded with our committees and with our libraries to help us in our work. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you. And thank you again for this huge honour. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful overview and introduction. It's quite impressive. And every time I hear more about it, I learn more. Not sure, are we taking questions?
Yeah, I'm very happy to.
Sure.
Yes, please do.
I see some hands up, but with all the comments, there is Silvestre. You have one?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks very much, Grant, for your talk. It's first time I hear this kind of structures and so it's very interesting. I was wondering how do you measure the effect of the advice? I mean, both on a personal level, but also on a maybe more national level. I'm not sure, but so yeah, how do you make sure that all these reports actually get to something?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways, and we're like any other organization trying to measure our impact, in that it's always hard, and so you always try. So there's a combination. So we use metrics, so we rely on things like operations, all the kind of basics. But within Parliament, we monitor Hansard, which is the reporting. So if we're named within the chamber, for example, because we work very closely with select committees, we can often see where our research has had a direct impact on those committees. And so the kind of way it would normally work is we would produce a post note to say, you need to be concerned about this. So a few years ago, it was marine microplastics, for example. One of the select committees then took that up as a topic. They asked us to do the initial briefings for it and identify witnesses. They then conduct an inquiry. They come out with recommendations. The government then has to respond to those recommendations. And actually, that led to the banning of microplastics in the UK. And so you have this pathway that you can follow. So a lot of it is very qualitative and it's very narrative summaries. But effectively, you say, this is what we did. We did our job by highlighting the route it needs to go. The politicians then took it on, and then that was the outcome at the end. And so I report on that quarterly to a board of MPs and members of the Lords, so that we know that we're on track for helping parliamentarians effectively.
Okay. Thanks.
Then I didn't see who was next. I'm just going down the list. I think the next one was Scott Bramer.
Yeah, hi. Scott here from Bergen in Norway. Congratulations, Grant, and thank you very much for a really fabulous presentation. Very quick question. You talked about research evidence rather than scientific evidence. I would like to know why Post made that choice, because already science is a very broad terrain, right? Especially if we include the humanities and everything. So then research seems to broaden it even further, because maybe you could potentially have research that isn't scientific or in the normal scientific realm. So yeah, why you chose those words?
Some of it, well, actually, many of it was simply for our parliamentarians to understand where we were coming from. So if you talk to the average MP, which I often do, about science, they think of science within their classroom at school. And so they immediately go back on physics, biology, or chemistry, and that's all science is. And so for a long time, we actually found that Post wasn't used enough by Parliament, particularly before I came, because we were very much called the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. And so every committee that wasn't the Science and Technology Committee thought that we weren't relevant to them. What I wanted to do was sort of turn that on its head, combine down the name into just Post, and say we are there for academic research effectively. And it's had the effect that we are now reaching out to more or less every single select committee. So we're able to work with everyone from Home Affairs to Education Committee, because as we all know, science underpins all of this, but a lot of parliamentarians don't know that. So I think does that answer your question? Yeah.
Then we have Arild Holsby.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. So I have a question. You mentioned SAGE, for example, which has probably been the sort of public face of this during the COVID crisis. But at the same time, there's also been quite a bit of controversy around SAGE. For example, the former chief scientific advisor setting up his own independent SAGE group. Has that sort of permeated through to MPs, and what has been the role of Post in that sort of process? Do you see that sort of the science advice mechanism has been weakened by this controversy?
It's a really good question, and it's actually it's a difficult one to really assess. So certainly I think SAGE was hampered early on simply because it was an unknown group providing unknown advice, and that certainly got the heckles up of many people. The government chief scientific advisor made the decision to publish minutes, to publish the names of SAGE, and to publish all the evidence, and that has certainly opened it up a lot more. And I found in many ways that's changed some of the discussion. What we are finding, though, is obviously we all know that science is not a truth. It's not an absolute truth that you have one day and you all act upon. But it's very much, this is what the current evidence on any given day says. This is how you could interpret it. And then the policy decisions are made separate to that. Where there's been probably unfair criticism of SAGE is blaming them for policy decisions and trying to say that, you know, it's clear that just because you presented these options, that's then become the policy and therefore you are responsible for that. What POST has been doing is very much looking at the same evidence that SAGE has been looking at and publishing alongside that. So where we agree, where we disagree, and informing parliamentarians of that. And what's particularly interesting is very recently, around some of the changes that have come in, such as around curfews or the rule of 6 within the UK, parliamentarians are now constantly calling for what's the scientific evidence underpinning that. So it's almost turned on its head now. People want to know what the actual science is behind all of these policy decisions.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I also have a personal question, if I may, which is related to your decision to move so heavily into science policy. Can you explain a little bit about your motivation for that?
I think I'd always sort of danced around with policy a bit in the past. So I had, I'd worked in National Institute for Care and Health Excellence in the UK, which is very much science then that's used for policy. I'd worked very much on global health topics in Australia and informing a lot of policy there. So I'd sort of done it as the academic feeding into policy. And I saw that sometimes within policy institutions, you don't necessarily have practice in academics. So a lot of people will move from academia when they're relatively young over into policy and then stay in policy forever. And so what I'm trying to do, and sort of successfully, is try to do both. So I still have PhD students in Australia, I still have research that's happening, and I'm keeping close to the science, but also doing the policy part. So maybe it's a bit of an experiment, but it's the model that the government chief scientific advisors, for example, use. Most of them are practicing academics.
Very impressive to hear. And also good news, really, that it is possible to juggle all the different tasks that come along with being a scientist, but also being active in science policy. Are there any other questions that people may have? I don't see any more hands. No, there's one. Mathieu? We're started, yeah.
At home. Yes, congratulations again. It was a beautifully clear talk. Clearly, you're not a pure academic anymore. I was wondering about international collaboration on your level of science advice. Is there something set up? Because it feels like it's completely uncoordinated between countries, and they're just beginning to pull together very different experiences with completely different, regulations and masks and everything else. Is there some hope that this will bring things together and somehow produce a better scientific future?
I hope so. So there's obviously international organizations for both government science advice and legislative. So on the government side, there's INGSA, which has produced quite a lot of evidence summaries to try and bring together government science advisors. And I know that the government chief scientific advisor to their counterparts in lots of countries, in Sweden and Germany, to compare notes and also to compare systems. So the model of SAGE is quite unusual in the UK compared to many others. And so in the past, they have tried out different models and seen, do different countries come to different conclusions with their own internal models for how to do science advice? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. What we've been doing at EPTA is try to look at how we're all acting in this realm. And EPTA is slightly different because some of us are both technology assessment and science advice units, like POST. Some are purely technology assessment and so can't really do the reactive stuff, whereas some are much more embedded within their parliaments. So we've been learning off each other and sharing information along those lines. And then more broadly, we do a lot of international work. Because we were one of the first science advice centres set up, we have been working in recent years with Spain, for example, which has a nascent unit that started. We helped develop the unit in Mexico. We've been working with the Colombians to develop science advice over there. So we try and work as much as we can internationally, but obviously difficult at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure if we were in a room, we would have lots more discussion. I'm just looking at the time a little bit, unless there is much pressure to move on. If there's one more question, I would allow. And while you're thinking, what I can comment on is Post definitely played a massive role in me starting to be interested in science policy or policy making. It was a completely new world when I started my fellowship. And I can only encourage everybody participating here today, whether you're in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, do look at the Post website. It's really informative and can inspire people in many different ways. There's no more questions. I'd like to thank Grant and congratulate him again. Amazing achievement, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you in future. Bye.
Thanks so much.